Thank you, Mr President. In recent weeks, I've met with representatives and supporters of some of the diverse communities that are active in Sydney. I share with the Senate tonight the information I have been provided with. These reports are deeply shocking, highlighting the brutality of colonialism and the tragic consequences of war and oppression. There is a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Yemen right now. After 2.5 years of war, a severe blockade is stopping crucial supplies from reaching desperate people. I'm speaking about this in the Senate because the Australian government is deeply complicit through weapons exports to Saudi Arabia. But first I will just detail the suffering that is occurring. Rathwan al-Lasbabi is 40 years old and he urgently needs a kidney transplant. The ABC's Sophie McNeil has reported that hospitals in Yemen, because of the blockade and war, can no longer perform transplants. Due to the blockade, Rathwan cannot leave the country to get a transplant either. What a shocking situation for him to be in and for his family to watch on. The Yemeni Ministry of Health estimated that even before these new measures, 10,000 patients died in the past year waiting for medical care. 10,000 in a year because there was not sufficient medical care. That figure alone is shocking and should be a wake-up call for us. The blockade is affecting the most basic of human needs, and that is food. On November the 8th, the UN Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Mark Lowcock commented on the tightening of the blockade. These are his words. I've told the Council that unless those measures are lifted and 5 particular steps that I am going to run through are taken, there will be famine in Yemen. It will not be like the famine that we saw in South Sudan earlier in the year, where tens of thousands of people were affected. It will not be like the famine which cost 250,000 people their lives in Somalia in 2011. It will be the largest famine the world has seen for many decades, with millions of victims. That is a quote from a UN representative identifying that millions of people in Yemen will die if the blockade is not lifted. 23 humanitarian organisations, including CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and the UN, have issued a joint statement on the blockade restricting aid supplies. This is from their statement. There are over 20 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. 7 million of them are facing famine-like conditions and rely completely on aid to survive. In 6 weeks, the food supplies to feed them will be exhausted. Over 2.2 million children are malnourished. Of those, 385,000 children suffer from severe malnutrition and require therapeutic treatment to stay alive. The current stock of vaccines in country will only last 1 month. If it is not replenished, outbreaks of communicable diseases such as polio and measles are to be expected with fatal consequences. That's from the statement of 23 humanitarian organisations. Now, where does Australia stand? Australia is complicit in this suffering through their cooperation with Saudi Arabia. Cooperation is probably too kind of a word. Australia is actually bragging about its arms sales with Saudi Arabia as this war intensifies. On the 30th of October this year, Minister Christopher Pyne announced he'd be visiting Saudi Arabia, and these are Mr Pyne's words, to promote Australia's world-class defence material and strengthen bilateral defence industry relationships. He went on, and in Saudi Arabia he would, and these are his words, meet with senior government representatives to discuss the bilateral defence industry relationship. Surely we all know that the people of Yemen are dying. Even though there's not much publicity, I think we'd all know that something shocking has happened there. And Australia is spruiking arms that kill these people. I mean, that's what's going on in this part of the world. Saudi Arabia is doing terrible crimes, permitting terrible crimes. We don't actually know the arms or value of the trade Australia is engaging in with Saudi Arabia. Despite a motion from former Green Senator Scott Ludlam, which called on the government to provide details, the government is continuing to hide what is being sold to Saudi Arabia. But we know it is being sold. At the very least, the Australian people deserve to know what Australia is complicit in this war, which is driving the famine. When you're spending money on war, when you're waging war, however it's playing out, it costs lives. The global community needs to place an arms embargo on parties to the conflict. The way we profit from the misery of the people in the Yemen is a disgrace. "100 years ago, Britain, responsible for so much death and destruction in its colonial zeal, sowed the seeds of Palestinian dispossession of the Nakba, the impact of which is still being felt by everyone living inside the borders of historic Palestine and around the world. The Balfour Declaration, delivered to Lord Rothschild of the British Zionist Federation 100 years ago, was a moment in history that is still unbelievable. As Israeli journalist Gideon Levy wrote, "There was never anything like it, an empire promising a land that it had not yet conquered to a people not living there, without asking the inhabitants." Historians such as Alain Papé have shown that the Zionist leaders understood the promise meant the country as a whole. This also meant that the Zionist leaders had no intention of honouring the partition plan, which was also a violation of the rights of Palestinian people. From the moment Lord Balfour penned those 67 words to the implementation of Ben-Gurion's Plan D, which started the ethnic cleansing of the land of Palestine, the intention of the Zionist leaders was to colonise the whole of Palestine. Today we have 78% of historic Palestine colonised, and the remaining 22% is under Israeli occupation. Today there are over 9 million Palestinians living either as second-class citizens inside Israeli's borders, under military occupation in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, or as refugees in surrounding Arab countries and in the wider diaspora. All of these Palestinians have been personally impacted by the violent dispossession of their homes and lands that began in 1948, and none have been granted the right of return. None have been granted the right of return. If you're a Palestinian, you can't return to your land. Decades of human rights violations, war crimes, deaths on all sides can be all attributed to the arrogance of the British, the colonial British, at the hand of Lord Arthur Balfour. This year, the Palestinian people called on the British government to recognise and apologise for the 100 years of destruction and dispossession instigated by the Declaration. It is unfortunate that not only did Britain fail to recognise their hand in the Palestinian Nakba, but British Prime Minister Theresa May attended a gala dinner celebrating the Declaration, saying that Britain is, and I quote, "proud of her pioneering role in the creation of the State of Israel." The centenary came and went without an apology from Britain, but that should come as no surprise. The lack of recognition of the genocide that was perpetrated by British colonisers on this land, and indeed around the world in so many other countries, still remains unrecognised. Talking of a resolution between Israel and Palestine, or indeed to talk of recognition in this country without first recognising the history and cause of the problem, can never result in a just peace, and surely peace with justice should be the starting point for any negotiations. The Kurds of the Middle East have common ethnicity, language and identity, but their land flows across 4 modern state boundaries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran. For centuries, the Kurds have struggled for recognition and autonomy, and repeatedly this has been denied in the wider geopolitical struggles in the region. Again and again, the Kurds have assisted in the overthrow of oppressors, in defeating the Ottomans and most recently in defeating ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Yet despite promises of recognition, history is littered with broken with broken promises to the Kurds. In fact, they continue to be oppressed by the nation-states in which they are embedded, denied citizens' rights. Considering the level of abuse, it is no wonder that the Kurds in Turkey at least have resorted to violent military action in defence of their rights. Their recognised leader, Öcalan, has been jailed for many years. Only mutual negotiation and recognition can solve this running sore. Kurds, as we know, have no homeland state of their own. In each country in which they live, they form a sizable minority, and in each country except Iran, they have struggled for autonomy for centuries. Such has been the fate of Kurdish people for millennia, constantly being attacked, massacred, deported. In each case, the dominant rulers of the state have frequently refused to acknowledge the Kurds as citizens and denied them basic rights. In Turkey, Kurds account for 18% or more of the population, mainly in the east and the south of the country. Following the Lausanne Treaty of 1923, Turkey denied the very existence of Kurds, and any expression of ethnic identity by the Kurds was harshly repressed. The use of Kurdish language was repressed, especially in state schools. And sadly, these practices continue across different countries where Kurdish people now live. Human Rights Watch documented many instances where the Turkish military forcibly destroyed houses and villages. 3,000 villages were virtually wiped off the map and displaced more than 378,000 people. The struggle continues to this day, greatly increased since the failed coup and autocratic rule of Erdogan. The PKK is a Kurdish militant organisation which has waged an armed struggle against the Turkish state for cultural and political rights and self-determination for the Kurds. The PKK has been labelled a terrorist organisation by Turkey's allies, including the US and the European Union, but interestingly, not by the United Nations, Switzerland or Russia. To this day, the Kurds remain the largest stateless people on this planet. Many feel far more kinship with their fellow Kurds in Iran, Iraq and Syria than with their nominally country folk in Turkey. In Iraq, Kurds make up around 17% of the population and form the semi-autonomous state of Iraqi Kurdistan. Yet between 1975 and 1978, 200,000 Kurds were deported to other parts of Iraq. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraqi forces were responsible for the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians and the destruction of 2,000 Kurdish villages. Most recently, the Iraqi Kurds held a referendum resulting in an overwhelming vote for autonomy. However, the Iraqi government quickly moved into Kirkuk, regaining political control and reclaiming the rich oil fields of Kirkuk. Many thousands of civilians fled towards the northern border with Turkey, fearing further retribution. In Syria, Kurds make up approximately 10% of the population, living mainly in the north. In some areas, the Kurdish language is banned. Children cannot be registered with Kurdish names in some areas as well. Around 300,000 Kurds have been denied Syrian nationality and any social rights. Yet Kurdish militias in Syria in support of US forces were the only ground forces that so far have managed to take on ISIS and win. The Americans supported the Kurds when it suited them, but then refused to support their bid for autonomy. The Turkish government has long feared Kurdish independence outside its borders, lest it provoke similar aspirations inside Turkey. Thus, Turkey felt threatened when Iraqi Kurds held and won a referendum for independence and threatened potentially crippling restrictions on oil trading, and have even threatened to invade Iraqi Kurdistan. In Syria, rather than supporting the Kurdish militias fighting ISIS, Turkey has actively attacked Kurdish regions in northern Syria. For Turkish Kurds, the double standards are extreme and discriminatory. That's what they have to endure. Kurdish fighters were celebrated around the world in 2014-15 as they withstood a months-long siege by the Islamic State, but then ignored in their own struggle for human rights. Kurds quite rightly condemn as hypocrisy the US policy of supporting Kurds when fighting for their rights against ISIS, but not when doing the same against Turkey. Abdullah Öcalan has achieved a status among Kurds much like that of Nelson Mandela. He's also been jailed for a very long time. Öcalan is a political theorist who first pursued a Marxist national liberation struggle uniting the Kurds across 4 countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran. He co-founded the PKK in 1978, leading the movement in a protracted guerrilla resistance in the 1980s and 90s. He was captured in 1999. Öcalan has developed a theory of loosely federated Kurdish communities that would not necessarily cause the breakup of Turkey's national territory. And I give emphasis to that because the Kurdish in their negotiations and in their campaigns are being very practical in terms of the current situation where there are now 4 nation-states and trying to work within that, but advancing their rights for some level of autonomy in that area. Öcalan has become a symbol of struggle that crosses many of the divides in Kurdish national politics. While there are large differences among Kurdish national movements, Öcalan is supported by many Kurdish groups. For the PKK, real negotiations can only begin when Öcalan is released from his island prison and leads the Kurds at the negotiating table for greater autonomy, for peace and cultural rights.